Hi, Mary Kate. Nice to meet you.
Hi. Nice to meet you too, Anthony. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. And for everyone watching and listening, could you give a brief introduction about yourself?
Sure. I'm Mary Kate Kloeblen. I am a fractional supply chain and operations consultant. I've spent my career in supply chain and I've kind of had experiences in all areas around the supply chain. Early on in my career, I worked in the 3PL space as an industrial engineer. And then kind of moved my way upstream into corporate retail where I was doing planning and inventory management. And then about 7 or 8 years ago, made the jump over to CPG startups. And so throughout that time, really learned a lot around end-to-end supply chain management from planning, logistics, warehousing, and then delivery to customer and kind of all the pieces in between. And so after about 7 or 8 years working, in personal care items, medicine, and then most recently healthcare, kind of saw a lot of opportunities for early stage startups to clean up their operations early and kind of be a resource for them. And so in the last 6 months, I've gone out on my own doing independent consulting. So it's been a lot of fun.
And what have been like the key findings from the startups that you've been working with?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, the biggest thing I've learned is kind of getting in early to these startups. Usually, the first or second ops hire is there's a lot of low hanging fruit opportunities to kind of clean up our reporting, clean up our process, and kind of create work streams that are able to give the operation a really great base so that it can scale further. And so I think the biggest learning I've had is, start simple. Use the resources that you have, spreadsheets, Excel, and the like. And then as the supply chain gets more volume, as it gets more complex, then find meaningful ways to kind of bring in technology to support that growth through like planning tools or even now there's a lot of order management tools and AI kind of driven tools as well, that can kind of assist in the scaling. But it's like get the right processes down first, clean things up, know where your costs lie, know where inventory stands across the supply chain, and then add in kind of more complex things to support those basic processes.
What are some like red flags when the startup owner, the chief logistics officer should be like thinking like, I'm missing this part now. This is what I should focus on. Like, how do you find those problems and know how to ask for help?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing is being mindful of how your time is being spent. And so, a red flag to me is when I'm spending way too much time pulling data for like a planning process, let's say, and it's taking a lot more time to kind of pull that data, put it through my spreadsheets, do the analysis, and then reach the conclusion on the decision we should make. And then the decision's like quite simple from all that data. That's usually a red flag where I'm like, wow, this is not productive. And to make like a yes or no decision, if it's taking all this time up and all this resource up, then there's an opportunity there to kind of add in, you know, it, automations, systems, et cetera, to support. I think another red flag is, as you're seeing kind of the supply chain working, just simple breakdowns starting to happen, whether that's a missed pickup from a supplier because someone was too busy to kind of double confirm and understand and kind of coordinate that aspect of the supply chain, or um, inventory being lower or higher than what you need to hold on to support sales. Just kind of starting to see like ripple effects of being too busy or having too many details to manage, kind of just using the existing infrastructure that you have.
And what about like when you're helping these companies, how do you help them with sustainability in their supply chain?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because I'm typically not brought on specifically to focus on sustainability. I think it's something that a lot of smaller brands are interested in and they do think about, but what I've found kind of throughout my career, especially in the startup realm, is actually sustainability and having a lower carbon footprint is like a really interesting effect of actually just running a better supply chain. So if you kind of think about it in a few different angles, things like having great inventory planning processes and forecasting accurately what your demand will be, that has a bigger impact on carbon footprint than maybe doing a carbon offset kind of program with your freight forwarder or your small parcel carrier, because the core of it is if you're overstocking on inventory, you're wasting precious resources to kind of create that inventory with your supplier or contract manufacturer, and then you're over allocating the amount of transportation you need for something that is going to sit in your warehouse. And if it's a product with an expiration date, like there's a chance that it might not move before the expiration date comes up. And then inversely, like if you're understocking on inventory, usually a remedy to that would be expediting that inventory through air freight or an expedited logistics service. And those, in its side of itself, have a larger carbon footprint than kind of slower transportation methods. So, like I was saying, it's kind of interesting because it's actually like financially advantageous to be sustainable just by running better efficiencies in your supply chain. And I think that it's maybe not always so obvious because the first places we think of when we think about sustainability are like recycled materials and carbon offsets and things like that, and those things don't really get to the core of the problem, which is like, are you being efficient with the resources that you have today?
And do you help with the planning of these resources with the startups?
Yeah, so I would say kind of within the supply chain like cycle, if you will. More of my specialty is within like planning and sales and operations planning. And so, kind of that byproduct of understanding how to create an effective demand forecast, how to create stocking policies around that demand forecast that are kind of striking the balance of having enough inventory, but not understocking at the same time. It's kind of my bread and butter, and it's where I know how to come in quickly and kind of create those resolves. And so, yep, it is something I've done before. And I think, especially early stage, there's a lot of interesting learnings I've had kind of just being able to do that and get a good plan in place that can execute upon and be efficient with.
So, what's the most important thing when planning these operations?
I think the most important thing is a few different aspects. I think kind of coming from corporate end of things where planning was very statistical based, very based on, the systems we were using. The business I had worked for was a long-standing American retail chain. And so we relied a lot on historical data to kind of inform future trends. What's interesting about when you get into a startup is there's not that historical data to rely upon. And also, every year the business changes, right? Because the business grows, there's more sales channels, new products. And so, kind of the first place to look at is just understanding how the business will kind of change and evolve over time, like not just looking at what it's doing today, but then understanding across the team from marketing, sales, product development, what are the things on the roadmap, and then kind of creating demand plans that balance both kind of the historical performance of what the business has done as well as what's to come and kind of having a forward looking eye. So that's kind of been an interesting distinction, is finding that balance and knowing that you know, it's not, that demand plan won't always be purely historically data specific or statistically driven. It's going to be kind of a mix of a few different factors. And then I think the other aspect of it is, like I mentioned, just kind of the cross team collaboration. And so the other big consideration for a startup is being cash conscious, right? And so you can't afford to, make decisions in a silo from like a supply chain perspective. So it takes a lot of kind of creating a plan, creating formats and reports that can translate well to your financial kind of partner in the business, and having them understand different scenarios, and how that impacts cash and kind of the bottom line of the business. And then lastly, too, like the other thing that's been really fascinating is kind of just understanding like the drivers of the business and understanding kind of the goals of the business. So a lot of times what's come up for me is there's opportunity to get a better price break because of ordering in economies of scale, and especially in the packaging world. And so it's understanding, hey, if we order an extra month of supply and that gets us to the next pricing tier with a better unit cost, is that actually better for the business than keeping the buy tight and conserving cash? And so it's also that balance, and just kind of making sure that you're asking those questions, you're giving the impacts, and you're kind of over communicating on what all the different scenarios are to make sure that you're aligned with your cross-functional team.
And enabling a sustainable supply chain is communication to all stakeholders. Does everybody in the startup realize how important they are to the supply chain? Or is there a lot of like teaching to be done to get everything in place?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it, like anything else, it depends. But I will say the last couple years in the US and just the VC environment being very different than what it was for startups, let's say like 2015 through 2021, even. There's less cash to be had, less capital to be had. It's more expensive to kind of raise funds and get debt to kind of finance the business. And so I think in the last couple years, more and more folks have been really understanding supply chain more and its impacts on the business. Um, I also think another factor of that is just seeing how supply chain was in 2020 through 2022, really, with port backups and delays and added costs. And so I think there's been a shift, I would say, in the last couple years around other cross-functional owners really getting more of a window into what supply chain is doing. But like anything else, like it's really important as a supply chain owner to kind of always add value by having a seat at the table and bringing those insights to the team. It's something that I think, regardless of where you stand in a business, like that's something you should be doing, something you should be kind of over communicating on and educating. And so I would say it's it's a little bit of both, right? It's like people having more of that insight into supply chain, but then also making sure you're creating those channels of communication and those reports, and that people understand impacts. So I think that that kind of answers the question, but like anything else, it depends.
So what are like great communication channels that you communicate in the startups?
Yeah, so I think, like I say this like a little tongue in cheek because everyone is like, oh, like let's not overload with meetings and things of that nature. But I do think it's really important to kind of create an ecosystem of meaningful meetings kind of on a regular cycle. The frequency is going to depend on the business, which stage it's in, how complicated the supply chain is. But I think what is super important is creating a structure where on a monthly basis, and maybe a little bit more often even, there's a meeting between sales, marketing, operations, finance, and you're really going over kind of what happened the last month forecast wise and sales wise, what's going to happen the next several months, and then aligning upon different scenarios and kind of having supply chain take those scenarios and model them out in terms of what the plan will look like. How does that impact cash? How does that impact inventory? And kind of creating a plan around those scenarios that mitigates risk but also supports the business at the same time. And then kind of after that initial plan, it's kind of bringing that back to your stakeholders and laying out those impacts and ensuring that there's alignment and sign off between the groups of like, this is what, from a demand and sales perspective, we've all aligned upon. From a supply chain perspective, this is how we'll support that plan. Here are the known risks, and we all feel comfortable with this. And so, like I was saying, like the meeting frequency can vary based on business, but ultimately, like those are the core of the kind of conversations and meetings and discussions you should be having on like a very regular basis. At least once a month to review the historicals and kind of review what the demand plan will be or could be. And then at least once a month on, these are the impacts to those plans. We agree on this is how we'll move forward as a business. And then this is what it looks like on our bottom line and in our budget and, on our balance sheets and things of that nature. So,
And I want to go back to communications. So, who owns the customer experience in the startups?
yeah, it's interesting. I've seen it a few different ways. The customer experience can live under operations. I've seen it done that way. And I think logical to do so, right? Like your supply chain is like the last touch point with the customer. But then I've also seen it live under like brand marketing as well. And that makes sense too, because it's about having a voice to the customer, gaining those insights, and kind of using it as another touch point for the brand as well. So I think ultimately it's like another highly cross-functional area. And depending on what the business's priority is, and how they want to leverage that customer experience, it can live in a couple different ways. But I think like the commonality, depending on like which department it lives under, is that there needs to be a strong bridge between supply chain and customer experience, both to like understand what customers are saying about their experience with the product. If it's a direct to consumer business, how they're receiving the product, any kind of insights there to kind of give feedback to supply chain for them to work on and prioritize within the work stream between, contract manufacturers or suppliers, logistics partners, etc. And then I think inversely too, like supply chain needs to over communicate when there are issues or delays. And that way customer experience can figure out how to communicate that to the customer in a way that is proactive, lets the customer know that we're thinking of them, that we want to take care of them. But it's also inevitable that issues happen in the supply chain. And so it's our job as operators to see those issues and like over communicate them and make sure that impacts to customers are known, communicated, and mitigated and considered. So
Mhm.
I would say that's kind of what I've seen and how I like to operate in that realm.
Mm. And I loved one of your posts on LinkedIn where you said like the excellence of operations is over communicating. And then you had another gem was about picking a carrier for your like product. So if a carrier screws up the delivery, it aligns to your business and they might not buy from you again.
Mm-hmm.
So those are a
Yeah,
couple of gems.
thank you. I appreciate that. And I think like more often than not, what I always try to portray in those types of posts is that like there's a lot of value that supply chain adds, and like we want to give the customers a great experience and we want to work with other teams to do that. And so I think people who might not be, as in the weeds in supply chain, like hopefully seeing that and saying like, yeah, like I need to also like work with my supply chain partner. This is a highly valuable part of the business that can make and break like what we're trying to build brand wise and marketing wise with our customers. So I think like anything else, it's just appreciate the shout out on those two posts. And I think my aim is just ensuring that operators are thinking in that way. And then people outside of, the operations supply chain realm also think of it that way and kind of see the value in those cross team connections.
So regarding planning and choosing carriers, do you have
Mhm.
like a certain strategy Or is it better to have one carrier or multiple? And I'm thinking this because of the communication. If you have too many carriers, will the communication dilute?
Yeah, I think it's finding the sweet spot. Too much is sometimes a recipe for disaster, especially depending on your volume. And also, too, oftentimes, there's not that much more of a significant financial benefit to having several carriers versus just having one or two. I think it's ensuring that your service levels align with what the customer expectations are, and that your carriers are performing in a way that also supports that. So that's one tenant. And then the second tenant, of course, is always price because you have to make a margin. I think it's typically I've seen in my own experiences is keeping it more simple, making sure that we feel great about the service levels of the carriers that we're working with. They're aligning with the brand, as well as we're keeping an eye on quality. We're keeping an eye on lead times and adherence to them, and keeping an eye on cost is kind of the right recipe. And I would say as you continue to add carriers, it makes that focus harder to kind of maintain. So my recommendation, like I mentioned before, is like keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate it. More complication usually leads to more complication.
I'll have to share another gem that you posted today. I think it was today. So, a good supply chain manager understands their costs, but a great supply chain manager can translate the financial impact of their work on the business.
Yeah.
So, could you give an example of that?
Yeah. I think biggest thing, and I think I listed out in the post, is from the supply chain perspective, especially planning. I mean, supply chain's a cost center. And so, for a startup, particularly where cash is sensitive, you need to know how much you're spending and what that does to your balance sheets and kind of your cash outlay. So, the biggest things that I've learned, that I've built before for financial kind of cross team partners is just looking at our inventory spend, looking at our landed costs, looking at our payment terms, and kind of creating based off demand supply forecasts when we need to bring inventory in, what we know our landed costs to be, and what we know our payment terms to be, like a very strong forecast month over month of when we can expect the cash to go out for all those inventory buys. And so I think that format, and then being able to give it to your financial partner, have them be able to look at it across their balance sheets and make any flags around the plan, is crucial. And just keeping that tight loop and that tight loop of feedback, and having your financial partner say like something doesn't align with the budget and it doesn't align with kind of what's best for the business financially, having them give that feedback, and digging to understand the why. Is there a spike in sales that we're expecting, a couple months from now? Okay, like what's the driver of that? Do we feel good about that plan? If it doesn't align with the financial goals of the business, how do we give that feedback to whatever team is driving that spike, whether it's marketing or sales? So I think it's really just kind of creating an ecosystem where there's like literally no surprises financially. If there are, then like I'm not doing my job well.
That's a great answer. What about, I want to still ask about emissions. Do these startups, do they count emissions already? Do their like VCs ask them about sustainability? What does that look like in the startups?
It's a good question. Like anything else, it depends. I've been at startups where it hasn't been a focus at all. And then I've been at startups where that was a core part of the brand, and that was one of our company goals in our OKR kind of goal setting session. And so with that, I think it all kind of usually the focus from VC, it depends as well. Like I can't speak too much to that, but I think if it's a core embedded part of the brand, that is where you'll see it embedded more in kind of the culture, which means looking at carbon emissions and looking at carbon offsets and impacts and trying to kind of quantify that regularly. But I guess I'm going to give the consultant answer, which is like, it really all depends.
Yeah, that's all around answer. So what about, do these startups have already somebody nominated to be responsible for sustainability, or it depends and it's all over the place?
It's also a good question. I would say, in my experience, it typically lands in supply chain and ops, and that's the team keeping their eye on it. Um, but I would say, like, the the findings of those kind of measurements and monitoring can be used by other teams to kind of use it as like a marketing um, angle, or something with brand building, or something that kind of aligns to how that's portrayed on the website of the business. So I'd say usually operations owns it, but kind of how it's communicated, it might be owned by other departments of the business.
Yeah, probably the startups have their main focus is just getting traction, get the operations flexible on like a normal state,
Yep.
that they go away from being a startup. Yeah. Um, I wanted to also ask more about planning, because from our conversation, like most of the sustainability work in the startups have been done by great planning. So are there some like great examples that you have that the planning has changed the company?
Yeah, so a few roles ago, we had been moving from a single fulfillment center to having two, one on each coast. And during that time, there was a lot of planning that I did around how we wanted to hold inventory at both locations, um, because a lot of our goods came from Europe and a smaller portion came from Asia. We had to also kind of focus on like how we are going to route those shipments to make sure both warehouses had enough stock of all of our items. And so, with that, there was some work also done around sustainability and efficiency and carbon footprint and kind of strategy around how that would impact our inventory holding strategies. What basically I found in that project was the more opportunities we had to kind of limit the amount of touches that the inventory had, between warehouses, and transferring that inventory between warehouses, like directly correlated to carbon footprint. And so, if let's say we had a shipment coming in from Europe, a majority of that inventory was needed at our warehouse on the East Coast of the US. A smaller portion was needed on the West Coast of the US. If we were in a space where, let's say, we split containers at the supplier and routed them in directly to both warehouses, like the impact of doing that was quite different than the impact of shipping all the goods to the East Coast warehouse, splitting, those shipments at the warehouse, and then sending a truck across the country. So that was an interesting finding. But then secondarily, the other interesting finding was the more that we could find opportunities to kind of consolidate pickups and deliveries, the better. So what that meant was also, when we were doing transfers from one warehouse to the other and vice versa, limiting those transfers to about one time, maybe two times a month, was more sustainable than doing weekly. And like consolidating that freight into like one or two very full truckloads was better than sending, smaller pallets LTL
Mm.
across the country. So just kind of the fascinating takeaway being that the less touches we had, the more sustainable it was on that inventory.
And you could also see it impacting the financial side, so less touches, less money spent.
Yes, exactly.
And with the great planning, the customers did not like, it didn't matter how much was the transit time between storages, if it was once a month or Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, to your point too, like at the end of the day, like, it's limiting the impact to customers because customer should come first in terms of how you're operating as well.
Hmm. And what are like the biggest things that customers appreciate? I know you said already proactive communication. Is there something else that they really want?
It's a good question. I think that we sometimes think of customer experience around like how the package looks and like what the branding looks like. But at the end of the day, I think what matters most to the customer is like how reliable you are as a business. And so, like, specifically, if you are a business that has a great product and people really enjoy your product, your branding is cool, it provokes a lot of interesting thought and conversation, whatever. If you're not getting your customers their packages in a timely manner consistently, or they're showing up broken or a hot mess, they're going to lose trust in your brand and they're not going to want to order from you. And um, I remember someone had a really good post about this several weeks ago around like what's more important, shipping speed or having like a cool brand. And if you think about it, like the majority of Americans use services like Amazon Prime to get whatever they need very quickly. And I mean, the value prop is like not how cool the products they're buying from Amazon are. The value prop is that they have a need for an item that's probably pretty boring. But they know if they place an order through Amazon, they'll get that item in the next few days and they can rely upon that. And so that's why they keep buying and going back to it because it's convenient and they know it works. So I think at the end of the day, that's kind of the other piece of customer experience. It's just like, are you reliable? Are you sending out your stuff in a reasonable amount of time? And um, are they showing up when they say they will for your customer? Because they are relying upon you to give them their product that they've paid for, and having the inability to do that, I think, speaks a higher volume than having a product that is like the coolest, most innovative.
Great. So uh, I wanted to still ask, if I'm a startup, what are my key metrics in the supply chain that I'd have to focus on daily?
Yeah, I think from an inventory perspective, I would keep inventory runway and productivity tied eye on there pretty closely. Logistics wise, I would look at container or truckload fill and like minimizing kind of any inefficiencies there. Um, from a fulfillment perspective, I want to keep an eye on time and full, accuracy, and then from kind of the small parcel front, or outbound logistics front, keeping an eye on, transit time to customer and adherence to transit time SLAs. And then as well as like quality, like, are the boxes coming smashed? Are they acceptable? And then lastly, it's always keeping a pulse on quality for the product specifically. So looking at customer complaints regularly, looking at acceptable quality levels and adherence to them from your suppliers and contract manufacturers. So that's kind of around the ecosystem, but the things that I like to focus on first.
And I have to ask this, but when you approach startups to give them your services, what are like the biggest objections they first give out to you before they realize that they need you?
It's interesting. So I think what's kind of fascinating about consulting in the operations space is that I think it's unlike kind of other spaces of the business where having outside help is kind of more commonplace. So, we see outsourced accounting teams, outsourced financial support, outsourced advertising, marketing support. But there's not a ton of outsourced ops and supply chain support. So I think it's not necessarily an objection, but I think it's helping founders understand like the value of outsourcing this early stage, helping them see how even though operations might be under control today, not having that strong framework placed while things are still kind of at a baseline makes it harder to scale in the long run. And then lastly, too, for a lot of founders, this business is their baby, rightfully so, right? Like they put all this effort into it. And so it can feel intimidating to like let go such a core part of the business. But I think, like anything else, as a leader, it's always understanding, where you might have gaps and at what point of the business does the business need you to focus on other things where you are kind of strongest at versus letting go of the things and kind of the like quote unquote Legos, if you will, that maybe aren't serving the business so well. So those are kind of some examples that I've seen. But I think now that I've gotten a couple clients under my belt, like it's nice for me and for them to see kind of like how gratifying it is to get that support, how much bandwidth it adds to the team, and also the value of having someone advise you and work closely with you to build kind of the right baseline of operations, kind of taking a lot of the stress away and out of the whole situation.
Cool. So, has there yet been anything that I haven't asked you yet that you'd like to answer to?
Good question. My goodness. I'm trying to think of a clever answer to that, but nothing, but my thoughts are evading me. I think we've been pretty thorough. So I feel like, yeah, I think we kind of hit it.
That's great. And probably for all the viewers, especially those that are from United States, they can contact you if they need help with fractional supply chain consulting.
Yeah.
And I'll put your bio
Awesome.
and LinkedIn profile in the information section. So,
Very cool.
anything else?
I don't think so. This was really fun. And thank you for having me at my first podcast ever. So I'm excited to be here and appreciate just getting to know you a little bit better.
The same. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good one.